This is art too, and I'd like to start with one of Kandinsky's poems. This is a poem that was published in 1916 in a Dada magazine, the Cabaret Voltaire, and it was in the midst of the First World War, and Kandinsky had just penetrated through a barrier of consciousness just a few years before, and he was a little distraught that instead of this triumph of consciousness penetrating through a resistance of several thousand years, that instead the world was caught in this war, this trench warfare. And so he wrote this poem, and the English translation of the title is Seeing. And it's a poem by one of the greatest abstract artists, in fact, the very first abstract artist in all the world. Blue arose and fell. Sharp, thin, whistled and penetrated, but did not pierce through. Everywhere, a rumbling, thick brown, hovered seemingly for all eternity. Seemingly. Spread your arms wider, and cover your face with a red cloth. And perhaps it is not yet displaced at all. Only you have displaced yourself. White chink after white chink. And in this white chink, a white chink. In every white chink, a white chink. It is not good that you fail to see the turbid. It is precisely in the turbid that it dwells. And that is where everything begins. There was a crash. So this is the kind of poetry that the world's greatest abstract artist wrote in the middle of the First World War. Kandinsky was a kind of peculiar character. He was born in Moscow, but when you look at his facial features, they have ancient traces of some Mongolian strain. When he was a little boy, the family moved to Odessa, which is not only in Texas, but is in the Soviet Union, down on the Black Sea. And there his parents split up, and he was raised by an aunt. And in Odessa, he was brought up to be very proper. A sort of a upper-class Russian household where everything is done the way it should be done. And he was sent off to Moscow to go to school, to become very proper kind of lawyer type, executive type, businessman type, and he did everything very properly. And he began to rise in the ranks of business and law and become appointed, and finally he just broke. He was about 30 years of age, and he just tore it. And he not only left Moscow and left his job, his career, the whole thing. He left Russia. He went to Bavaria. He went to Munich, to München, and enrolled himself in an art school. It's amazing, absolutely amazing. And there he struggled. He struggled with what Igor Stravinsky called the original sin of our times. The original sin of our times is non-recognition, non-acknowledgement. They ignore you. They don't pay any attention to you. Everyone ignores you. No one pays any attention to you. In the 1940s in the United States, there was a black American author named Ralph Ellison who wrote a fantastic novel called The Invisible Man. That as a returning veteran from the Second World War, this black American was just ignored by everyone. And so he, in order to confirm that he existed, kept installing light bulbs in this little hovel where he lived. And Ellison's Invisible Man begins with the sentence, "I have 1,119 light bulbs in my home, and I'm still not quite sure if anyone can see me." Non-acknowledgement is the sin of our time. That is to say, as soon as you step one footprint outside of the assigned role, they don't see you. You have stepped out of the spotlight of approval into the dim darkness off the stage. You are not seen. And if you continue in that way, if you step not only over the line, but you walk over the line into the darkness, you disappear. You're gone. You don't count. This is not only true because of sociological stuffiness. It's not only true because of psychological conditioning. It is true on one of the most scary levels of all. It is an actuality that really occurs in the structure of the universe. It's one of the most upsetting things to understand, and it's a cause for most yogis going crazy. Because they come to see and understand that the phenomenon happens because of the structure of the universe, and it's not just a sociological problem. It's not just a psychological preference. But it has something to do with the way that the universe works. But the person who successfully faces and engages this situation becomes an artist. Whether they paint, whether they compose, whether they sculpt, the medium can be your own life. It can be the clothes you wear, the place you live, the style. One becomes an artist. Art has a most peculiar quality, and it's only in terms of the development of this education that one can position and understand why it is that this happens, why the structure of the universe is reflected in the psychological conditioned habituation, why the sociological expressions of it are an accurate barometer on what really happens. We have talked many times about the squares of attention, about how the colloquial phrase, a frame of reference, is a very popular way of saying that one can only keep track of the picture that one is interested in. One only has a focus, a square of attention, a composition of alertness, which extends just so far but doesn't take in everything. In fact, it takes in only what is framed, only what is in the picture. But this education discloses to us that what is in our square of attention, what's in our frame of reference, changes, and it changes by an evolution of phases and stages which can be recognized, which can be understood, and that this phase form change is characteristic of universal development, that it actually happens, and that we, as very interesting figures, move through this spectrum of phases of development, and the further that we ourselves grow, the more that we not only encounter a new phase of development, but a previous phase goes out of our square of attention. It subsides. It doesn't get erased. It isn't lost, but it becomes, let's use the term subconscious. So that as we enter a new phase of our development, we leave a previous phase that slips into subconsciousness. Now, this whole displacement of phases does not happen in nature. It never happens in nature. Nature knows nothing of this, and so Mother Nature could never tell her children anything about this because she herself does not know. And if you tell her, as some of her most beautiful children have said, Mother Nature, why didn't you tell me? She denies it, that it happens. Because nature knows nothing at all about the supernatural. She knows nothing about transcendence. She has no idea. Mother Nature has no conception whatsoever of the transcendental Father realm. Though she engages with it completely and is fertile because of it, she doesn't know it. So she couldn't tell us. And we saw during the whole first year of our education that the way in which the natural cycle of development happens, there's no such thing whatsoever as a displacement of phases. Nature happens in its way. In fact, it continues to be the basis of everything. But out of nature comes an objectivity which we know as things, existence, objects. And the objectivization of things, of existence, is on the basis of a little white lie. In actual nature, when we can participate in actual nature, there's a ceaseless matrix of change. It's always going on. It's always dancing. It's always Maya. She's always scintillating in her dance. And as long as one participates with her, dances with her, one is completely protected in this process. But for things to occur, for existence to happen, the very atomic structure has to polarize itself. And it falls out of the dance. It falls out of the play. It falls out of the flow. It rains. It's like an atmosphere that becomes so supercondensed that the little droplets form and they fall. It rains out. Things, existence, rain out of the atmosphere of nature and make the material stuff out of which everything is formed. And the first material stuff is atomic hydrogen. First thing that rains out of nothing, the dance of nothing, the atmosphere of just plasma primordiality are the atoms of hydrogen, and out of this all the other elements are built. Out of this things happen. And the first polarity is the polarity that's there in alpha hydrogen. And it doesn't happen just courtesy of some special creation on one planet only. Well, atomic hydrogen happens everywhere that one can care to observe. Even in interstellar space, in between stars, there are clouds of atomic hydrogen, hydrogen 1. Even molecular hydrogen going up to deuterium, up to hydrogen 2. And rarely, after some kind of supernova, one finds tritium, hydrogen 3, which is the element that's indispensable in nuclear bombs. But the rain of material that comes to be things, to be existence, to be made, this body, that objectivity is made up essentially at the lowest foundation of actuality out of atomic elements that are built up in stars from hydrogen. And it only holds its shape as long as the polarity is the electromagnetic polarity, plus and minus, of atomic elements, of atomic structure, of molecular structure, of the chemicals, of the biological, of the bones, as long as that holds. So that on the ritual level, polarity, polarized energy, is the way in which form is held. And in nature herself, she doesn't polarize. She plays. So existence is polarized and nature plays. Nature is a process, ritual is an objectivity. And that's the Tao Te of the universe. That's how it happens. It's the play, and out of the reign of the play comes the things. So between the process of play, of nature, and the things of ritual is the first pair, the first kind of tandem pair that we have. It's the 0 and the 1. And out of that binary language, everything else is generated. And so in nature, in the natural cycle, that square of attention begins with nature. And one of its sides is ritual. And as we saw, there are two other sides that happen. There's another process that comes into play, which is the process of language, of myth, of experience, of feeling. And this process of language, of myth, of feeling, of experience is parallel to nature. It's a process just like nature. And what reigns out of language, what reigns out of experience, is the inner objectivity. The things of the inner world. The material of the mind. And so ritual and symbol, body and mind, are very objective. And nature and myth are very fluid. But all four of them make up a square of attention which is natural and which is complete. But we saw a couple of months ago that as soon as that cycle is complete, as soon as that square of attention, as soon as nature is complete, something happens. She's fertile. She's pregnant. And she gives birth to something which is not herself. Nature gives birth to the supranatural, to consciousness, to vision, to magic. But as that vision comes into play, as a phase, it joins the frame of reference, the square of attention, and so one of those phases has to go out. It's like a principle. It can only be 4 at a time. And what begins to slide into subconsciousness is nature as a part of the frame of reference. And she does it so easily because it's not objective. It's only a process. And that process, the natural process of the matrix of change, because it wasn't objective, it slips into subconsciousness without anyone noticing. And that's interesting, it's surprising. It's in retrospect a little shocking that that happens. But it's nothing compared to the brick wall that one runs into in terms of art. Because art, for the very first time, involves a completely new phase, a new objectivity. Because the work of art reigns out of the process of vision. The work of art is the object. It's the objectivity that comes out of the conscious play of vision. And the work of art displaces the works of ritual. Those original objectivities are no longer a part of the square of attention. Art displaces ritual in the square of attention. And this causes a catastrophe. Because while nature could slide into subconsciousness without upsetting too many apple carts or anything else, it's very difficult to have existence slide into subconsciousness. To have the body slide into subconsciousness, try it. It's not so easy. And especially if on the mythic level, one has fixated the identity, one's identification of one's feeling center, the ego, identified it with the body, so that when the body begins to slide into subconsciousness, the ego says, shit. Or if it speaks French, merde. It's because its whole existence is becoming what? It resembles death. As the work of art displaces the body, there's this tremendous struggle, which is life-threatening, seemingly, which is even more basic than life-threatening. It's as if the mind is cracking and losing itself. Because just as feeling has allied itself, just as the nexus of feeling, the ego, has allied itself with the body, in order to keep itself firmly balanced, the ego has balanced the body with the mind. And so when the body begins to slip into subconsciousness, what's the phrase? The old phrase from the Doors song? Before you slip into unconsciousness, let me have one more kiss, one more lashing tress. As the ego experiences the body slipping into subconsciousness, it always identifies the mind also slipping into subconsciousness at the same time. And so it's losing both its frames of reference at the same time. And so the ego, the tribal ego, fights against the transcendental person tooth and nail. This is why the term shit. Because it is a nasty, brutal struggle. The ego cannot, will not give up. And you can sell it whatever bill of goods you want, that this is a spiritual person, the ego says, who needs it. This is impractical. You're not going to be able to earn a living. The tribe's going to turn a cold shoulder to you. What are you going to do then? How are you going to go out and collect bananas in the forest when they exile you? You're going to be an outlaw. The artist is forbidden. It's one thing to be a problem individual within the tribe. It's another thing to be a conscious, fully mature, developed person who's freed from the body basis of necessity. Because the person is a new kind of objectivity, a completely new kind. The artist is a new kind of object that was never there in nature. The body as an objectivity fits in nature. Even the mind as an objectivity still fits in nature. But the person, instead of being an integral objectivity, is a differential objectivity. Completely different. A transcendental conscious form that's objective, not in terms of coming together, but is objective in terms of going apart. It's the very image of madness to the ego. No wonder it resents it. Not only resents it, fears it. Not only resents and fears it, but will not have it. One's identification is threatened. Because the artist, being a differential form, doesn't want to be encumbered by these little equal signs in the equations of the masks of the tribe. Will have nothing to do with that. The artist says, I don't need that identity. I don't need these identification papers. I don't need this tribal approval. I'm myself. And they patiently, behind their tables of judgment, say, oh, is that so? And as you leave the room, yes, that's so. Bye. And that's when they do you in, one way or another. It used to be that they would just spear you. In the good old primordial days, when there weren't laws and there weren't all these social consciousness, they would just do away with you. You were a threat. You're not only a threat to them, but you're an example for others. And how many others are going to leave the tribe? What's going to happen to the tribe? What's going to happen to tribeness? But not only tribeness, it's not only that the person, as an artist, is freed from the tribe, but it's that a completely new kind of objectivity, which is not natural, occurs and extends the bounds of nature beyond itself. Now, instead of just talking about nature, we have to talk about nature and consciousness. We have to talk about conscious nature. And of course, the ego, not being stupid at all, says, what next? And of course, the person, the artist, looks up, because their nature is not to look down. Nature is not to look at the integration further coming together, but to look at the differentiation that's further going apart. And the person says, beyond me, there's a whole new world I want to explore. Any artist in any field is ready to explore further. That's what they like. Their nature is not to be satisfied with having achieved themselves. They want to put themselves in play in a wider universe. In a conscious universe in which they say, we're not interested in a universe anymore. We're interested in a cosmos of infinite possibility. Wants to re-enter back into a play which is now augmented by another dimension, the dimension of consciousness. Wants to play in 5-dimensional conscious space-time. Is interested in that. So the artist is ready to go on, not just satisfied to completely upset the square of attention of nature, but involves a very peculiarity. It is so peculiar that when civilization first reached a level of being able to discursively express in written language the structure of now what occurred, this is about 5,000 years ago, that it was seen as a radical recutting of the nature of this whole square of attention. instead of the square continuing to be the geometry of stability, a new form came into play that had never been seen before, had never been seriously entertained before. Instead of the square remaining the geometry of stability, the new geometrical form was that of the triangle. And you see 5,000 years ago in a place like Egypt, as soon as the language of expression began to talk in an artistic, conscious way of this tremendous development, the triangle displaces the square. And it didn't take them but a couple hundred years to see that a three-dimensional triangle was the perfect symbol for the transcendental cosmic person. And one had the pyramid. But one has to backtrack a little bit. One has to go back a little bit to see what the nature of this is, because it is so fundamental in its structure that it's worth attending to for just the 2 minutes that it takes to tell it. All right. Nature as a process, and existence that reigns out of it as an objectivity. That's one pair. Allied with that was a second pair, that language and its interior forms, the symbols. That was a second pair. But now you have the magical visionary process and the artistic person that comes out of it, a third pair. So you have nature and existence. You have language and symbol, and then you have vision and art. So you have a triangle. You have a thrice greatest paradigm to deal with. And instead of being limited by the square of attention that always was the paradigm in nature, one now has a brand new form. One has the triangle. And just as recently as a couple of years ago, one would see the triangle. This is on the cover of a book concerning the spiritual in art, 1890 to 1985, right here in Los Angeles. And the whole impetus of this exhibit was to show that the 20th century was a development of the further implications of the spiritual, which is a form in conscious nature. And the trigger figure on this whole development was Kandinsky. It seems like it should have evolved through maybe several hundreds of people, or a handful of people. It evolved through one person. Objectivity is something which is truly astounding, because there's always some first example. It's hard to believe that in ancient Precambrian times that there was a first bacterium. Or that out of the primordial ocean there was a first fish that crawled ashore. And yet it is absolutely certain that that's what happened. It is mind-boggling to realize that in terms of genetic DNA, every single human being on the planet is evolved from a single woman who lived about 4 million years ago, named Lucy by archaeologists. That we are all, every single human being on the planet, are all children of this woman who lived about 4 million years ago in northern Africa. It is hard to believe. It is hard to believe that Kandinsky was the first person to make an abstract painting, and that was the trigger that developed the whole realization in retrospect that one had finally crossed over completely to a new threshold. And the 20th century is peculiar. It has a lot of affinities with 2,000 years ago. It has tremendous affinities with 3,000 years ago. It seems to have this millennial quality, this flavor that once in 1,000 years there gets to be some kind of special circumstance. Now that we live in a time where that special circumstance is active again, is right here. And in those terms, those special moments, one can actually take steps which could never have been taken before, and up to that point would have gone nowhere, but now not only can be taken, but they go somewhere. But where they go is not anywhere that is. It's nowhere that has existence. It's nowhere that's in the mind. But it's a geography of the differential spiritual person that as they go, that geography manifests itself and makes itself. This is very difficult to understand. It's even more difficult to believe. But we are educable to the point to where we can not only understand and believe, but we can become very good navigators on this ocean, an ocean not of geography, external or internal, but an ocean of possibility that we can learn to navigate in terms of the possible infinity. And out of that navigation to build, through our own exploration, the cosmos that really does then occur. It's extremely difficult to understand. 5,000 years ago, stretching on tiptoes, the spiritually cognizant trigger in Egypt wrote the way that could be understood at that time, that Ra rises each day, and if we join ourselves alchemically to Ra, when Ra rises, Ra will carry us with that rising, and we will live again in a new day. And that new day becomes real as Ra rising makes it real, and we will then live, our lives will be real in that day. And that because Ra can rise every single day, forever, we will be immortal in that way. Because that particular day that Ra makes by his rising and shining joins in alignment the continuity of the millions of years that have already occurred in that way. And it is wide open for the untold billions of years, or trillions of years, or you run out of phrases, because it's an infinite possibility. It's infinite life. It's eternal life. That's the way it was expressed 5,000 years ago. That's what it says in the hieroglyphics written on the insides of the pyramids. Why would they write them in hieroglyphics, in symbolic language, on the insides of pyramids? Aren't they supposed to be tombs? Right. That's exactly right. But they're not tombs to end life, but they're tombs to transform life. The whole purpose of being put in there is so that you can come back out again. The transformation of the tomb to the womb is the ultimate magical displacement that Mother Nature and Father Consciousness do together, they give birth to completely new life, eternal life. This is the way that people used to talk about it 5,000 years ago, when there may be only a handful of people at that time who could understand this. Now it's so simple that you find grade school children talking about it, except that they don't hear what they're saying. So this education just gives you a chance to reposition so that you can hear what grade school children talk about in 1997 all over the world. They get it, but they don't understand that they get it. One teaches the kind of geometry in the 10th grade worldwide that was once the purview of the most esoteric schools in the world in only 2 or 3 places on the planet. We give it to 10th graders as if it were just normal part of development. The same with this. We're going to take a break. But before we do, let's just come back and let's take a look at 3 different sets of pairs. Nature and its objectivity in the body, language and its objectivity in the mind, vision and its objectivity in the artistic person. It's sort of like the transition was, because the square was so operative, so long, and considered to be the paradigm, that the first way in understanding it was in terms of halves. The square had one half that was nature and ritual. It had a second half which was myth and symbol. And now there was a third half that was magic and art, or vision and art. So that the original geometry of the pyramid building Egyptians, it wasn't an actual geometry. It was about 2,500 years before the actual development of geometry by Euclid in Alexandria was really developed. It was at least 2,300 years before Pythagoras developed the fundamentals of triangular geometry. But back in the original geometry, before they knew what they knew, while they could still talk the game, they characterized it as 3 halves. So the original geometry of the pyramid builders was based not upon a calculated geometry that we would have in 10th graders today, but it was based upon a limited single case geometry. The archaic Egyptian engineers could find 2/3 of any number, but they could not go beyond it and apply geometric principles. So they did everything, they built everything by gerrymandering the comprehensive ability to find 2/3 of anything. They could find the square within the 3 halves. And that's as far as they could go. There's a discussion of this in a mathematics book. It's reprinted by Dover Paperbacks by Giddings on the mathematics of the ancient Egyptians. You can buy almost anywhere for $5 or $6. Let's take a break and we'll come back. Let's come back and re-express something which is so evanescent, so subtle, as to escape the attention, the concentration of almost everyone. There are very few people who can just readily appreciate and lay out for consideration this particular structure. It's very, very delicate. When we have a square of attention, that's the natural cycle. I know the cycle is not like in a circle, but we're seeing it as a square. It actually happens circularly, but it occurs to us as a square because of the way in which we're able to participate with it. It squares itself off because of polarity. And so it actually occurs, it seems like, in the material world as a pair of pairs making a square. Whereas if one were like super yogi and one would see the actual occurrence, it's actually circularity that has a quaternary kind of a procedure to it. So that if you were looking to see how to objectify that quaternized circularity, the easiest way, the shortcut to objectify it, is not by a square, but by an X, by the pair of diagonals. And there are whole yogas that have been developed on this planet in places like India to deal with that kind of aspect of things. We don't have time enough in lives to master all of those kinds of delicacies. But we do have time for just 2 years to master this kind of broad smorgasbord of the planetary culture and the way to set a table for ourselves in terms of the 21st century and beyond. If you look at this natural frame of reference, and nature and ritual are taken away, and they become subconscious. The ancient way of talking about this is not that they were subconscious, but that this realm where they went to is the netherworld. It's the below this world. Initially, the netherworld was taken as synonymous for like an afterlife or something like that, which is not accurate, and which was a mistake that was not made on the highest levels of sensitivity. So don't make that equation. It was actually always like another world. And the way to objectify the netherworld was to see it as a realm that was under the earth, specifically as a cave. As a cave. Because of men and women for tens of thousands of years using caves geographically and physically for the initiations into that whole process. And the making of pyramids was just to make caves appear above the surface of the earth. But they were still, the chambers, the transformation chambers, were man-made caves. So you have nature and ritual, the process of nature and the body is now belonging to the netherworld. Whereas the world now becomes the realm of myth and symbol. The realm of language and the mind. That becomes man's world. So that a human being then has to deal with this world of experience and feeling and language and myths and its objectivizations with the mind and thoughts and ideas and concepts. We have to deal with this world and we have to deal with another world. But we have a third realm which is like an overworld, the upper world, celestial world, the transcendent world, which is now real to us because we've entered art. And so the world of vision, the world of art forms, the world of conscious person is like an upper world. So it's like 3 levels. It's like a triad. It's like a trinity. So that if one is going to navigate in terms of real maturity and fullness, you have to take in all three realms at the same time, symbolized by the triangle. And the linking of those three worlds together, the only way that they can be linked together is to understand that your reality is the continuity that flows through all three realms. It's the only common denominator in the whole thing. And so it becomes extremely important for the conscious person to keep a navigational strategy alive. Because it's their only way of, quote, identifying themselves. It's a terrible usage of term because you don't want to be trapped in identities and identification, which is now tantamount to labeling. No conscious person wants to be labeled. In fact, the very thing that you don't want to do is you have to not mistake any mask that you wear for yourself. And because one gets very good at this, men and women become quickly very sharp at this, they realize that it's not only masks that disguise themselves, but that the very face that one would see in a mirror is now tantamount to a mask. Your own face constitutes a mask of the spiritual person who you really are. And one becomes then suspect for any kind of a face. And this is a jeopardy. This is a peril because the spiritual person is still a person and needs to have a face. And if any particular face is suspect, and yet one needs a face in order to be expressively oneself, you can see that there's this kind of conundrum. If one tried to hold on to, if one tried to cling to, if one tried to preserve and protect some kind of identity, one would be trapped in an increasing tension. And in fact, this is one of the fundamental bases of neurosis. That you insist on this particular identity being you. Actually, on the deepest level, it's selfish because it isn't that you insist on it being you, but you insist on it being yours. One way around this is the way of the Bhagavad Gita. Use the face, but don't own it. And because you're using this face in this situation, in a different situation, use a different face. And so you get a plus. Instead of having something which is yours, you now have all kinds of possibilities which are all, quote, you, whenever you're using them. And you're traveling light because you don't have to carry a trousseau of identity around with you. Which comes in very happily when it comes time to exit this particular world. Okay. Wardrobe change. It's this kind of continuity that then becomes a sense. It becomes a kinesthetic sense of strategic navigating. And so the spiritual person becomes alert that they're able to navigate unknown. Not only unknown terrain, but terrain that doesn't even come into existence until they begin to navigate it. Remember Ra rising each day, and only as he rises does that day become real. That's a very clumsy 5,000-year-old way of expressing it, but it's still a clumsy beginning way of being able to talk about it. And after a while, you get so that you get it. And now they can talk about it in many different ways, but you can live it, which is, after all, everything. So that the netherworld, that subconscious realm of nature and the body, while it still counts, it's still there, the body certainly isn't erased, isn't gone, it's just not in one's attention. But in your strategic navigating, you have to remember that in fact it's still there, it still counts, and you have to remember what was important for it, what's important for ritual, what's important for nature, and work that in, factor that in. So that the art of the mature person is to include what isn't there in attention also. One has to include what is there and also what is there but not perceptible. And so there's always then this kind of a sense of a ratio. A ratio of what can be consciously taken into the composition and what subconsciously needs to be a part of the composition but can't be shown. And this kind of ratio was the basis originally of what was called rational. Rational means ratioed. And the first people to use that language were, in a conscious, artistic way, were the Pythagorean Greeks. And they used it because they were working with the triangles. In fact, the fundamental, original Egyptian triangle was always an equilateral triangle. 60 degrees on each of three, whereas the Pythagorean understanding was the 90-degree angle, the right triangle. When you have the equilateral triangle, the angles are balanced. But when you have the Pythagorean right triangle, where one angle is 90 degrees and the other two are 45 degrees, what's balanced is that the square of the largest side balances the squares of the other two sides. So that there's a volumetric implication that's kept in balance rather than the physical actuality that's kept in balance. And so Pythagoras is a whole jump ahead, is a whole development ahead. The beginning of the classical Greeks with Pythagoras is a whole different level that never occurred to the Egyptians. As sophisticated as they were, they never got that there was another phase beyond art that was available. They might have talked mythically about it. They certainly did. They may have even talked symbolically about it, which they certainly did. And yes, they envisioned it. And yes, it's there in the art when you know how to look at it, but they never had it in their lives. And it's the classical Greeks after Pythagoras that are first to develop a sense of history. Real history, not king lists, not chronologies, but history in the sense that someone lives in a realm that is a conscious process that's as powerful as nature. It's as powerful as language. It's as powerful as vision. It's the process, it's the new phase, it's the matrix of change of history. And it was so difficult for the post-Pythagorean Greeks to come into play there that it almost sank the ship of personal navigating. The encounter with the conscious process of history with the classical Greeks, almost ruined them. It stretched them to almost the breaking point. So that very quickly they had to come up with oars that would allow them mobility in keeping this personal ship afloat, not only on the ocean of vision, but on that further differential ocean of history. How do you navigate on that? How do you keep your strategic sense of navigating on that? Because not only do you have another world of nature and ritual, and a world of myth and symbol, and an upper world of vision or magic and art, but that obviously there's a fourth world. There's yet another realm that's now unfurling itself, and that history as a process is so enormous that what rains out of that ocean is the cosmos itself. And so the mature person, about 2,500 years ago, came face to face with a tremendous dilemma. Not only had they just recently come to really begin to handle strategic navigation so that spiritual conscious persons could be quite real in and of themselves, a person now was as complicated as a whole tribe. One spiritually conscious person is in fact as complicated as all of the intelligent life on the planet up to that level. Become a world in their own. But instead of being triumphant comfortably at that point, they realized that they had just opened the door to an even larger challenge, that one now has to be real vis-a-vis an objective cosmos, which is infinite objectivity. This was daunting. And the way that it was handled was the way that all growth that's too much is handled. Smoke and mirrors. They used a projective paradigm that was a scintillating version of the old. And they said, well, the cosmos is certainly objective, but it's beyond us. It's a realm of fixed stars. And it remained that way for 2,500 years. No one ever got it. No one ever saw that when you go out in the night sky, that all those stars that you see are not embedded in some far, vast, distant velvet. The divine jeweler has not laid out his goods on some beautiful, deep, dark display case, but that they are real in an infinity of space without end, and real on levels of numbers that are computer-boggling. And that was not seen until here in Los Angeles in the 1920s, just about 70 years ago. It was the first time. In fact, there was a trigger. There's one person who first understood that that's what was there. Saw through the projection of 2,500 years. His name was Edwin Hubble. Right up here in the San Gabriels. Right up here at the observatory. Looked through a 100-inch telescope patiently year after year, plotting, and realized that most of the stars that we see form a pattern. And they belong to a single pattern. But there are some objects that one sees that are not stars. They are separate, different, whole patterns of stars equal to the pattern of all the other stars that one sees. That most of the stars that we see on level of several hundred billion, are all part of a galaxy. And that one could look through certain spaces and see other galaxies that are quite different, that have their own hundreds of billions of stars, and that one can see galaxies without end. Hundreds of billions of them. And when Hubble published his Atlas of Galaxies, there were a lot of people who just saw it as some kind of abstraction, because that's usually how the ego defends itself, is to say, well, this is an abstraction, and not to use it as a new dimension of life, but to use it as some projected abstraction. Oh yeah. Oh, we know all about galaxies. People say today, do you? If our sun were the size of a grapefruit, the earth would be the size of a pea, about 6 feet away from it. The nearest star to us is about where Denver, Colorado is. If you get rid of the abstract projection, the wind of insight carries one so quickly beyond comprehension that if you're not navigating in complete openness, the only result is total vertigo. So these veils that are there are the stage props that make it easier to stay in your seat. To keep you convinced that there is a seat, there's a theater, there is a play, I have a role. Or that at least everybody you know has a role and you have the seat. Something like that. It's that kind of a play. And one can stretch and get it that all the world is a play. And that this is one hell of a production. But there is something we need to do in our lives, and that's to realize that people peering in have no idea whatsoever that this is an actuality of taking away even the prop that there is a world that's a stage. Right now we're looking at Art 2 at Kandinsky and the pair, because we're always taking pairs, because it's a way of keeping a balance. Kandinsky and Max Ernst, the two artists that we're working with together. And pretty soon, we're going to let Kandinsky and Max Ernst as a pair subside and bring another pair in. We're going to bring in Henry Moore and Frank Lloyd Wright. And after dealing with them for a cycle of the moon, we'll let that pair subside and bring in another pair. Igor Stravinsky and Friedrich Schiller. Schiller, not so much an artist, though he was an artist in literature, one of the best in German history. He wrote some of the best dramas of all time. But we're using by Schiller a series of letters that he wrote to a youngster. 28 letters on an aesthetic education. What you have to really consider to be able to open up completely, letter by letter, stage by stage, until you've gone through like a whole lunar cycle, and you're able to see that you don't really need all the props. You don't need to have a seat. You don't need to have a play. You don't need to have the costuming. That beyond that is a realm of play that you're at home in, amazingly, where you make up whatever scale of props, whatever scale of drama, whatever scale of interparticipation that you wish, without end, no limitations whatsoever. Here's how Kandinsky then writes another poem about that particular aspect. Pleasant sounds, protracted silence. Where art thou, synthetic chain? Thou hast been so far in many pits. Where didst thou go, O tenuous thread? Synthetic chain, O tenuous thread. Do pleasant sounds come from thee? Pleasant sounds? Oh no. But protracted silence. It's this kind of a quality that's there in the poems, but it's there in spades in the paintings. When Kandinsky learned to paint in Munich, he painted a lot of Russian folk and mythic images, like this nice lady. 1905. He was almost 40 years of age and just beginning. Within 5 years, Kandinsky made the world's first abstract watercolor. It has nothing to do with the mythic level whatsoever. It has everything to do with objectifying vision. His earliest art is kind of like a symbolic shaping of myth, whereas this abstract painting is an artistic shaping of vision. And because it was an artistic form out of vision, it was purely of consciousness, which was both a triumph and a difficulty for Kandinsky as a human being, as a man. Because he was the first to come upon it, he had no comparison whatsoever. There never was an abstract work of art before 1910. Ever. On the whole planet. Never. And because he was the first, he was like unique for himself, that he made a fundamental error. He considered that all art purely then must be conscious and abstracted away from nature. The epitome of this outlook became characteristic then, not only of Kandinsky, but of that realm that he touched. And as a school, it was solidified later in his life in Germany at an art school called the Bauhaus. Originally in Weimar, and then after some problems with the way in which German politics were going, in Berlin, and then they very quickly closed it down in Berlin. Because the Nazis, who based themselves upon a mythology which they symbolically owned, didn't want to hear anything about all their alternatives of maturity that were not touchable by their party principles. And so Kandinsky was one of the first artists to have his art condemned as degenerate art by the National Socialist Party, who came into power in 1933. Which was peculiar because Kandinsky had so felt at home creatively in Germany that he had taken out German citizenship. He's a German citizen. He was the head of the greatest art school in Germany at the time. And went from being the pinnacle of success to being the first rejected person in about one day, as soon as they came into power. Because he was conspicuous upon the world stage. And because also he was a courageous enough man that he simply said, if you take this attitude, we'll just close the entire school. You're not criticizing me as a man, or even just this art school, but you are drawing a regressive blind on the future of humanity. You're condemning yourself to a dead end. And he said so much at the time. Some of the most poignant criticisms of the Nazis came from Kandinsky and his example of saying, we are not only not cooperating, but none of this is going to happen with this kind of politics, with this kind of sociology. Example, in a way, of a very sophisticated Gandhian non-cooperation. But Kandinsky moved to Paris. He and his new wife, Nina. And in Paris, Kandinsky has a whole new play. When he was in Munich, his development of the abstract style involved a movement of color that had still the romantic, visionary qualities of volume play, a kind of a Rembrandt quality. Here's an example, painting with a white border, 1913. That you can see the beautiful play of color. Whereas when he was at the Bauhaus, his color play was more in a geometrizing, a use of compass and slide rule, rather than doing the chiaroscuro quality of volume color that you would find in Rembrandt. In other words, Mondrian rather than Rembrandt. But when he went to Paris, a completely new kind of Kandinsky started to come out. And Kandinsky began to make the kind of forms that belonged initially. I want to show you two. When he was at the Bauhaus, he had paintings that were almost like a language of formal color, geometrizing color. And when he went to Paris, this changed so that the lines of the ledger were erased and the forms were allowed to be suspended. And instead of the language having some kind of pigeonholing, the language was completely free. In Paris, Kandinsky learned to paint abstractly in language of tongues. He spoke in spiritual tongues. His vision extended so completely far beyond his time that only now in the late 20th century are we able to appreciatively follow what he was able to say some 60 years ago. There were very few people at the time who could speak that kind of a language. Now there are hundreds of millions of people. In the next century, it'll just be a part of the normal language of everyday life. This quality of facility with conscious person navigating, though, entails a confrontation with history that can't be helped. It's a structural fact of growth that as soon as you become capable of dealing with this kind of transcendental geometry, then the phase of history becomes real. And one has to deal with it. One has to navigate with it. Because the cosmos is no longer just going to be content to be a projection of some screen of fixed stars, but is going to actively beckon us to participate in the play in which it is real. Now you can reduce this down to saying, well, there are aliens in spaceships who are contacting us, but that's a complete neurotic projection compared to the actuality that we now are at home in an objectivity that wants to play with us. And if we turn our backs on that and try to regress back, the play will get rather rough. Not because of insistence, but because of the very structure. Because when the cosmos wants to play, its little nudges extend for billions of light years just by nudging. So you want to grow up enough to be able to play and not get nudged. That's essentially what the 21st century is all about, is understanding that the limitations of instructional education not only came to an end over 200 years ago, but are positively radioactively destructive now, and have been for several generations. But they're bona fide psychic death from here on out. Don't drink those liquids. So this kind of an education, though it seems that there are just a few, nevertheless, once a trigger is pulled, it's pulled. And the cosmos wants to play. Next week, we're going to take a look at the way in which the development of abstract art from 1910 to 1914 evoked a nudge from the planetary context enough to precipitate World War I. And that by not paying attention to it, it precipitated World War II. And that by trying to falsify the situation, World War III came very close to happening. And only by virtue of some people saying, we get it, that World War III didn't occur. Because by 1962, some people finally did get it enough to tell the cosmos, don't nudge us too much yet. We're just getting used to it. And fortunately, 1963 happened. More next week. Thank you.